Previously on InnerZension Radio.
People have this misconception that their worry will somehow protect them. And the biggest jump that I find that people really need to make, they're afraid to take the risk of letting go of their worry, their anxiety, their fear, their rumination, because they believe they need those things to somehow protect them. And the only way they're ever going to really be truly convinced that they don't need those things is to experiment with letting them go.
Welcome to InnerZension Radio.
Welcome to InnerZension Radio, and like always, we are still on the journey to inner peace and all the different considerations thereof. Today, we're going to be talking with the very well-respected, internationally recognized Richard Moss, as he talks to us about some of his works, most notably his book called Mandala of Being. It's a book, as you'll find out, that transformed my life. But Richard Moss is an internationally respected leader and visionary thinker in the field of personal transformation, self-healing, and group energy dynamics. He was actually a medical doctor back when he started his first career, and then ended up having an experience to where he wasn't fulfilling his life duty, so became an extraordinary leader and transformational speaker, worldwide lectures and trainings and retreats all over the world. He's the author of 7 books, and they're all pretty much on transformational processes and the art of conscious living. Now, if you'd like to find more of his work, and you would like to support the show, which we would be really grateful, simply head to InnerZension.com and then click on radio and find his interview, Richard Moss, and then scroll down, and all the books are in there. They're embedded in there, and it's part of our affiliate link so that we get a little bit of money from those payments. It doesn't cost you any extra money, but it really helps us out. So we really appreciate you shopping through us for our guests. And with that, let's get to the interview. The amazing Richard Moss with me on Skype call. We're doing an audio interview, and couldn't be more grateful to have him on InnerZension Radio, because his book, Mandala of Being, this is not his latest work, but it changed my life, and it changed my life so significantly, from an aviator flying F-15s in the military to becoming a counselor and psychotherapist. This one book was kind of the pivot point of it all, and I was going through a great amount of turmoil and suffering through that kind of period of time. And so first, I just wanted to say, Richard, thanks for being on, but thanks for writing that book and changing my life.
Thank you, Chris. That book was a labor of love. It was. It took me five years from when I really started to write it, and I basically used up a great deal of my free time between work and travels and things. And it was my attempt to really share what I distilled at that point from 35 years of consciousness work, exploration, teaching, and in an effort to help people be able to do for themselves what I learned to do for myself, and to help other people learn for themselves. And of course, it's all about awareness, and it seems pretty remarkable to me that the changes, I think we should do an interview of you, the changes that you've gone through to go from flying in the military, flying fighter jets to what you're doing now. Because it just brought to mind something years ago, I guess sometime in the 1980s. I was at a program, and there was a man named Russell Schweikart there, who was an American astronaut. And of course, he'd been, I don't know which branch of the service he'd flown airplanes in, but he was the first American astronaut to go extravehicular. And at that point, he was a consultant to the state of California on energy use. And we were there for a weekend together with a group of other very interesting people. And at some point, I know I'd had a chance to talk and present, and he came to me and he said, Richard, what you're talking about, he said, it's really important because he said, my friends that like to fly fighter jets aren't going to stop doing it till they find something that makes them feel just as alive.
Mm.
And something's made you feel really alive because you've moved on to the work that brought us together.
Well, that's really interesting because alive in this context is a little bit different, because in the old alive was adrenaline flow, and this new alive is receiving energy in the moment. And that's kind of cliche, but it has to do with what we're going to be talking about. And I have felt, and I'm doing some long hours because I do a full-time job at the psychiatric hospital, and then I do my side private practice as well. So I'm doing, 12 to 15 hours a day. But what is really strange is that I get more energy, particularly from my private practice clients, because they're wanting the kind of help that they're seeking, not being told what to digest or whatever. But I'm noticing that I'm getting more energy throughout the day doing my line of work, which is far different than the old career when, working long hours again, but just feeling completely drained at the end of the day. So,
yeah.
I wanted to get into this mandala of being because I was able to, I was filling in for another therapist, so I got to do another group. And of course, I picked Mandala of Being. And it's not the first time I've done this. I worked up at the rehab a couple of years ago, and I was doing the Mandala of Being out in the grass in the backyard of this rehab facility. So there's like 50 people all in a circle, and we're imagining the now in the middle of the circle. And so, we would go through this person's thoughts or emotions, and then we would pinpoint where on the mandala they would be, standing. So they would physically walk to that spot. This is exactly what you talked about in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just amazing. I had a guy in there today who was there during my last Mandala of Being discussion. I mean, the chances of that happening are just ridiculously small because it's a different hospital, it's a different town. And so, but he remembered, and he remembered my name, he remembered the mandala. So anyway, is it true that the further we wander away from the now, like our mind strips us away from experiencing the five senses, say, kind of our connection to the now, that the further away we get from the now, we have more anxiety?
Oh, yeah. Anxiety is almost basically a symptom of disconnecting from ourselves. And the way we disconnect from ourselves, just so that the listener can understand, a mandala is a form of Eastern sacred art. And it basically attempts to depict in different ways the journey from the ego or the separate self, a stage of development that we all live, to the deep connection to the essential self. And so the word mandala is Sanskrit. It means circle. And the mandala being basically says everybody knows intellectually that there's only the present moment. But we all have this incredibly deep, layered history of ourselves that, in other words, we have the past, and which are beliefs and memories and many, many things. Some of them we can access consciously. Some of them are deeply embedded in us from very early in life, or have become such patterns of behavior that we do them automatically. But the Mandala basically says when you lose connection to your breath in your body, the five senses, and even deeper, the intuitive senses, really deep into your being and nervous system. When that connection is broken, it's because the mind, the thinking mind, the representational mind that operates through words and thoughts, that mind has led you into four basic directions. And the directions, if you looked at a clock, would be, for example, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. And if you see that there could be a line connecting 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, or 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, in the Mandala of Being, those four directions represent when the mind takes you into stories, judgments, and beliefs about yourself. And for example, the story, I'm not good enough. This is the kind of deep, kind of embedded story in so many people. And of course, as soon as you have that thought and you believe it, you identify with it, you'll become unhappy or anxious or uncertain or depressive. So that's an example of a very prevalent me story. There are others that, where sometimes we say, I'm smarter than you are, or I'm better than, things like that.
Grandiose.
So, yeah, grandiose. I call it either the stories about yourself make you grandiose and make you special in that grandiosity, or they make you depressive and make you special in your depressive unhappiness. So I put that position when I draw it at kind of the 9 o'clock place. Across from it at 3 o'clock are just all the kinds of stories we have about other people, and basically about anything that the mind can represent. So to the extent that we, money, for example, or about people, we have judgments of people. We have judgments about money. We have stories about money, things that we believe that we don't challenge. And so those stories will, again, maybe make us angry or make us resentful or bitter, or they'll overvalue money and become very anxious about it, or will undervalue money and become irresponsible about it. So those I call the you stories. So on the 9 o'clock position, those are me stories. And at the 3 o'clock position, there's stories about others, but I just simplify it, you stories. And there are deeper levels of this, maybe we'll get to, that not important now. But for the image for people, then that's the subject and object. That's the me and you stories that we all have, that we do with our thinking. And then we have the notion of time. And so a baby doesn't know that it's a me until it begins to also have a sense of memory about itself. And that's a developmental process. So the past is at 6 o'clock. And we spend a lot of time in the past. We use the past to, we tell ourselves, for example, my father didn't love me. Or, my mother was too selfish, and that's our favorite ones to blame, usually your mother and father. But these beliefs and ways we look at the past become the justification for judgments about ourselves and ways of reacting. So that past story, which is more like a baseline of memory, that's at 6 o'clock. And at 12 o'clock is everything that we can imagine about the future. And that's always going to do something. The way you imagine the future is either going to make you hopeful and eager and excited and anticipating, or it's going to make you anxious and worried and fearful. And once the mind starts to run wild, the fear can become terror. We can literally terrorize ourselves with the ways we imagine the future. So those four directions, the judgments and stories and beliefs about ourselves or about others, the selective things we choose to remember from the past, and then the ways that those memories of the past become projected into the future as either very fearful or hopeful stories, beliefs. And of course, the future is imaginary. The past is reimagined. And at the center of those were those that the connection of it all. Where it all begins is always the present moment. And even though we use the expression now, what we're really talking about is a deep consciousness, not just the ego level of consciousness, which is about me and all the stories we tell ourselves, which I've just sort of basically explained. But it's the embodied, deep connection to yourself and the quality of awareness that is. It's this deep level of being able to see without judging, experience as if for the first time, again and again and again, to live without an agenda. Even though you can have goals, you're not attached to whether you reach the goals. The goals are important, but if you're attached to reaching the goals, then every moment you're measuring, am I there? Am I not there? How close? Which is all worry. So saying it again very simply, when we leave the present moment, when we're not in that deeper quality of awareness, we're basically in the mind in stories about ourselves, others, our past, or the future. And that's can be depicted as a circle. And as you say, you showed it to people and you moved around the circle. And that's because when we physically move and we change positions in some form, because I've worked with people who were unable to physically move, but they could move their arm. And so they could move their hand on a piece of paper. They draw their circle, draw the little circle in the center that represents present moment awareness, the now. And then they could say, oh, yeah, I'm over here at 9:00. I'm really caught up in a me story. Oh, that's about a judgment in me. Oh, and it's making me insecure. It's making me depressed. Or they look over at the 3:00 and they, oh, yeah, that's a judgment about my children or about my boss or about my wife or husband. And it's making me angry or distrustful. Yeah. Oh God, then now my mind's so in the past. And that becomes the justification for why I don't feel good about myself or why I feel too important about myself, and so forth. Those four places are, and once you know, those are the only places your thinking representational mind, which neuroscience would now tell us is primarily the activity of the left hemisphere, the left cortex of the brain. Once you know that that's what you're doing, you can wake up and go, wait a minute, what's my actual experience right now? What happens if I'm not caught in these stories? What is this moment? Who am I exactly? What does it really feel like to be in my body, alive right now? If I could just take some distance from those stories. And that's the work. Learning to take that distance, come back into the present moment. I call it the beginning of ourselves. Start all over. And that's what it's a process of recognizing what we do that causes so much suffering, recognizing what we do with our thinking, and beginning to live more and more from that aware place that's embodied. And it's really the language of the heart. The body, the heart is both a physical organ and also, more importantly, as a metaphor. And the right side of the brain, they all share one language, but they can't talk with words until the left side of the brain comes aboard. Unfortunately, we start to believe the words more than we actually believe the experience of ourselves in the present moment. So babies or children are always in the present moment. And I think that's why Jesus said, except as you be as a little child, you can't enter the kingdom. But we stop being in the present moment. And for me, in my experience, and it's now more than 40 years of working with my own process and teaching people all over the world, the thing that causes our suffering is the stories we tell ourselves, the things we believe, the judgments.
So true. And you brought up a little quote from your own New Year's message. I was going to read a little bit more of that. I thought the most important statement for me was, there is no bigger game in town than to digest everything that is putting you in opposition to anything in the moment.
Exactly.
Mandala of Being. And really anything taking us out of the moment, well, I guess would be either emotions or thoughts. Right?
Yeah. Well, as long as you're using the word emotions, I make a distinction between feelings and emotions, and I describe this, I think, pretty carefully in the book. Um, and there's a sequel to the book called Inside Out Healing, which kind of takes the methodology of how to work with the mandala, makes it simpler for people to use. But the distinction between feelings and emotions, thinking is a mode of consciousness, but it's based on using representations, concepts, words. And so the word tree and the thing that is a tree are very distinct. They're not the same thing at all. And I think it was Wordsworth, the poet, that said, nature has no borders. Okay, well, when you look at nature through the right brain, through the heart, when you feel in it, into nature, which is why being in nature is so restorative, the borders disappear, and that quiets all these different kind of warring voices inside of ourselves. And you look through the left brain, so it's the rational conceptual mind, everything has a name. There's this tree and that fence post or that bird. You know, everything's distinct. And so I almost lost my train of thought there. I think I have.
It's okay.
Well,
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, where I think I'm going basically is feeling is this natural mode of consciousness, like a baby giggles. It doesn't giggle because of a thought, you know, or it cries, and it doesn't cry because of a thought. Some sensation has triggered it. Okay, so feeling and sensation in the body um, are a fundamental mode of consciousness. Thinking is very distinct, and it comes much later. And it's like the baby, you know, the body is maybe the most complex and intelligent part of us. And the feeling nature then is also a very subtle, fluid, like weather, constantly changing mode of knowing things in the immediate moment. I mean, you know in an instant if you can trust someone or not. Then you can think about why, but you know. Or you know in an instant, we talk about gut feeling or something, but you know in your body right away when something's right or not. And if you lose that, then you become, well, unfortunately, sociopathic or psychopathic in terminology we use. But emotions to me are distinct. They're part of the modality of feeling, but it's a particular feeling that's created by a thought. So like the example I used before, there's so many people, very high functioning people, that will often stand up and say, but this me story is, I'm not good enough, you know? And what they're really doing with that is they're saying there's a feeling or a sensation inside of me I don't understand, that sometime early in childhood and then moving forward in time as I grew up, I began to believe was the story, I'm not good enough. And when you think the story, when you believe I'm not good enough, you immediately have an emotion. And that emotion could be frustration or sadness or depressive. It's just, if on the other hand you say, he doesn't care about me, which is a judgment of somebody, or maybe that's your husband, maybe it's your boss or employer. In the moment you make that judgment, you feel angry or resentful. So the emotion of anger, the emotion of resentment, the emotion of, of certain kinds of sadness or depressiveness, or so these are created by thinking. And that I think is a really important distinction. Feeling is a very natural, basic way of knowing things in the present moment in the body. And emotion is the way the body recognizes what a thought has done to you, how a thought has aroused you. And you don't realize you're doing the thinking. We're so identified with the thinking. We've been doing it all our lives. And the whole purpose of the Mandala of Being book and the Mandala work was to show people, as soon as your body doesn't feel good with an emotion like anger or resentment or bitterness or anxiety or fear, that's because of your thinking. I mean, you see a snake and you get afraid, that's not a thought. It's an instinct, an instinctual response. I'm sure there were plenty of times when you were doing things in you're a fighter many times in life, but in that particular part of your career, where there was natural fear. Fear basically is our teacher of survivals, but there's a different kind of fear. This constant gnawing worry or anxiety, the things we do to ourselves about money. Money can, if you think about, I won't have enough money in the future, whether that's tomorrow or the next week, it's exhausting and debilitating, and
Boy, that sure is.
it's
I've been
soul
there.
soul deadening. Yeah, well, I have too, and I have friends that have, and I just think about that all the time, and all over the world. I mean, one of the deep pieces of work I did with myself over the years was to make my peace with money, and that because I realized that money, whether I had it or didn't have it, I mean, starvation is a different thing altogether, but money wasn't anywhere near as important as loving, and the capacity to love and be loved doesn't take money. You know, but there is a field of necessity in which all of us need a certain amount of money. In our crazy world, people have confused money with identity. So the more I have, the more important I am. And the less I have, in some ways, the less important I am. But if you really come back to the center of the mandala, you find that basically we're born with the capacity to feel what you were talking about, that energy that gets you through the day, from the beginning to the end of the day, because you're doing something that is what your soul's been called forth to do. And instead of coming out at the end of the day tired and because of all day long having stories that say this isn't the right job for me, or I shouldn't be here, or they should be like this, which is just emotion after emotion and exhausting, you come out at the end of the day with all this energy because you were living in the present moment doing what you were called to do, what your heart wants to do at this point in life.
Yeah. So I think and this is just excellent. I'm following you all through this. I've got lots of different directions we can go. I think the most meaningful for the listeners at this point would be, how do you get back to the center? How do you get back to now, once you've figured out you're on this venture in mind land or in thoughts or even emotions and beliefs? Obviously, awareness is key. So you have to know that you're not in the center. And then from there, what happens after that?
Well, it's a really, really interesting question, and it can be answered kind of simply, or the truth is it's complex. I think, having been in the military, I did not, but I, for example, the years I was spent as a high school and college wrestler, or the years I spent as a rock climber, once I was climbing, I didn't have fear. When I thought about the climb ahead of time, I had fear. So I learned that through my body, through rock climbing, not so much through surfing, but I did a lot more climbing, through mountaineering, through being very physical, I could come back to a state that felt so wonderfully good. It was a state of flow. Then later in life, as I kept going, I wondered, well, why can't I experience flow all the time? And that's when I began to observe, well, when was I in a kind of natural flowing state where I had seemed to have pretty inexhaustible energy, and when was I in a state of reactivity, or in the body it feels like contraction, so the short answer to your question is I wanted to know why, very specifically in my marriage and at home and with my stepchildren, I was overbearing, thought I knew it all, judgmental. But when I was in my work with people where I didn't have the same deep kind of emotional connection, I could be really centered, present, non-reactive, expansive, heartful. Why was I that way in one environment, and then why was I contracted in the other environment? And that's when I taught myself the mandala. I began to realize I tell myself different stories in these different environments, and I knew in my heart I wanted to be able to live that way in any environment, and that's what the mandala work was about. So the how we do it starts with wanting to. It starts with knowing, in a sense, that there is a path. I think in Buddhism, in the in the Noble Truths, Buddha says that, for the ego, all life is some dimension of dissatisfaction that can go all the way to deep emotional and psychological suffering, and that there's a way to be free of that kind of emotional and psychological suffering and dissatisfaction. That there's a methodology for it, and that maybe the only sin was to know there was a way to set yourself free, but not to use it. And so, its answer to your question is, people are listening to us now. They hear something in your voice. They feel something in your voice and in my voice. They've met other people. Maybe they respect someone from their church, and that person has an uncanny ability to just be with what is, to be able to see what's not right, but not to complain about it, to be positively proactive, not to have to protect or hide anything emotionally. I'm thinking of the Dalai Lama when he was asked. I think our listeners know that Tibet was invaded by China, that the Tibetan culture was systematically destroyed, that people were put into forced labor, and killed by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And the Dalai Lama was asked in an interview, how is it that with all of these atrocities that the Chinese have perpetrated on your culture and your people, you've never spoken with anger or bitterness about them? And he answered, because I feel better.
Mm.
And then he added, if I talked with anger and bitterness and resentment about them, I will have taken the war inside of me.
So he's definitely feeling something, but not falling into the trap of going down that rabbit trail.
Exactly.
Exacerbating that emotion.
Well, it's impossible to have the thought, they shouldn't do this. It's unfair. It's wrong. They're bad, without you becoming angry, resentful, bitter. And that's your body that's suffering. Mm-hmm. And this, that's the secret to true nonviolent protest is you can't let yourself have violence inside yourself if you're going to effectively change violence outside of yourself. And that's a path. That's hard work. So I'm 72 years old in 2 weeks, and I'm talking about that I've consciously and diligently walked this path I'm talking about for 25 years. And before that, I was on a path. I just didn't have so clearly an understanding that each moment is a new beginning. Each moment, and it's not that I always feel good. But I know that if I can't understand what my thinking is, or what kind of deep, let's say, psychological or ego dynamic may be causing me to feel contracted, I'm not going to act on it. I know, and I teach this, that I am 100, it's better even to exaggerate it, I am 200% responsible for any form of reaction. It's never the fault of someone outside of me.
You own the reaction regardless of what's happening outside of you.
200%, 300%, 500%. And in those moments where I do react, and it's much, much less so now, but I'm not an angel. I'm not a saint. I have a body still. No, but when I do, instead of saying, oh, damn, I'm reacting, I just go, oh, wow, thank you. Now let's see if I can understand what I was believing.
Well, you were being triggered to something of the past.
Sure, exactly. A simple example is, when Kathy and I fell in love, or that is, we just, we were friends for a while, and then she had a deep visionary dream about us. It moved a lot of energy. She told me about it after we hadn't seen each other for 4 or 5 months. And I just said to myself, this is a remarkable woman. Is there any reason I can't say, I was a single man, is there any reason I can't say yes to love with her? Let me repeat that. Not yes to loving her, yes to love with her.
Mm.
And immediately I had the answer, yes, I can. There's no reason not to. No. And so we started down this journey, this life journey, which has been profound and just astonishingly joyous. There isn't an hour that I'm not consciously aware of gratitude to be able to share life this deeply. But for her daughters, who were, late teens, early 20s, later 20s when I came on the scene, they'd had their mother nearly to themselves for 10 years since her previous marriage. And since, for one of them, the father. And so for a long time, there was a lot of, let's say, coldness would be kind of a calm way to put it. And around me being around, around me being around. It was, and any of us know that if you're in an environment with an adolescent who doesn't want to be near you and resents you being there, you feel it.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't react outwardly, but inwardly I did. I was judgmental. I was critical of certain behaviors. And I went inside, and it took me a long time. And suddenly I saw an aspect of my mother, her part of her that was pretty rule bound. I mean, I was raised under her rules. My dad was hardworking and gone most of the time, and her rules made me, a really good student, and I learned some very important and good values. But I resented those rules. I rebelled when I was young, and there I was seeing myself kind of imposing those kinds of rules uh, on these young people. And as soon as I saw that, I stopped. As soon as I saw that, I went, that's, and then I began the journey. It doesn't necessarily mean that they've come to love me. It's like a slow thaw. They're slowly, they're happy, their mother's happy, but because, it's just an example that anyone can relate to, where I'm 100% responsible for my judgmentalness. Even I didn't act it out. I'm 200% responsible for my my criticalness, even if I didn't express it outwardly. Doesn't matter. It's better if you don't express it outwardly, but it's still poisoning you inside.
Repression.
Yep. Well, I wasn't repressing because it was conscious. I was suppressing.
Oh, suppressing. Right.
I was suppressing my reaction, which is, a lot more constructive than acting out a reaction.
Sure.
But people, if they're sensitive, can feel that because, your energy field is just not wide open. But what I'm trying to say is that after all these years and all these years of work, in the last few years, I've had to go in again deeply, not in life-threatening situations or anything like that, but just base day-to-day living. And I will say it again, we're completely 200% responsible for being triggered. It's not your mother's fault, your father's fault, the government's fault, the politician's fault. It's not the job's fault. It's not the market's fault. It's always, fault is a strong word, but the left brain blames. The neuroscience for that is fascinating. And if there were time, I would talk about it, but I don't know that it's essential. But simply the left brain rationalizes and it blames, and it doesn't know any other thing. As far as cause and effect goes, it's about blame. And there's just, if you're blaming someone, take a look at yourself.
Are we kind of a left brain country or culture?
Chris, that is a question of the era. Yes, we are, and we've gone through stages, but it basically, the left brain cannot recognize anything alive. And I was stunned when I heard an economist. We were both on a panel presenting a couple of years ago, and this particular economist was quoting the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, who back in the 70s, after he'd gotten the Nobel Prize and therefore was an expert, Milton Friedman pronounced that, quote, the purpose of a corporation was to maximize short-term gains for investors. So think about that for a second. The purpose of a corporation is to maximize short-term gains for investors. So investors own a piece of the company, but they don't work there. Okay. Short-term gains would be like saying the purpose of Richard Moss or Chris is to make me happy or the people nearest to me happy in the short term, regardless of what happens to anyone else. And of course, companies like Monsanto use that, and many, many other companies use that to justify marketing poisons like Roundup, which is, is water-soluble antibiotic. It's used as an herbicide, but it's true. It's actually patented as an antibiotic, and it's in everybody's bodies now, and it correlates with an increase in cancer, Parkinson's disease, and autism.
Sure.
Just like cigarettes correlate. There's been no proof cigarettes cause cancer. It just correlates. But if the purpose of Monsanto is to maximize short-term gains for the people who own shares in Monsanto, then it doesn't matter what they market. It doesn't matter how much they know that it's dangerous, because their purpose is to maximize short-term gains. This is a form of insanity, but for the left brain, it's totally reasonable.
Yeah, interesting. It's like an avatar for the narcissistic owners below it.
Right.
It seems very narcissistic, but they're not people. People are running it.
Well, actually, the left brain doesn't know people. The left brain cannot recognize anything that's living or real, only something virtual. It has to be a representation. Whereas our hearts and our bodies, think of a baby. A baby doesn't want your words. It wants the sound of your words. It wants your touch, not that you have hands, and it's true of all of us. We don't want someone to tell us they love us unless we actually feel the emotion in their words, the realness of it for them, which means we're both. The speaker is feels just as wonderful as the one spoken to. Mm-hmm. And so the answer to your question is yes. Our educational process. The way I like to put it is, how would you have a curriculum for love? How would you have a curriculum for trust? How would you have a curriculum for empathy, compassion, forgiveness? These are the most substantial, essential aspects of a human life, and the most important virtues of a human being. I think compassion and forgiveness and trust and humility among are virtues. But how do you have a curriculum for love? How would you introduce Love 101 and give an examination on it? I mean, go ahead.
I would bring in Carl Rogers' work. In my opinion, I'd be teaching them how to understand, and then how to accept what you understand, and then communicating that to the other person. That to me is the definition of love, when I fully understand someone else and I accept. I mean, you're talking a very small portion of relationships. The people aren't willing to even understand the real person underneath that other person. So you're already in the higher echelon of the minuscule amounts of relationships where both parties are fully committed to understanding the other person. But then when you add in this acceptance, like no matter what you're feeling, I am accepting you. That to me is unconditional love.
I'm totally with you. I agree. And it was a kind of rhetorical question because, for example, if you're studying language, you're going to take an examination. If you're studying history, you're going to take an examination. They're going to grade you. I went to medical school. You get graded on anatomy. You got graded on chemistry, pharmacology, biochemistry, things like that. And
there's numbers and
yeah. So that's right. If it's quantifiable, that's the left brain. Nothing wrong with that when the left brain's in service to an open heart, but you can't give an examination for love, right? The best thing, I was working with a couple earlier today, and the woman shared with something she had shared in front of a group of people that they meet with that they participate with about her relationship to her partner. And I started with, mentoring him. And then at a certain point, his growth really was dependent on the relationship. So I asked if he would talk to her, and I met her, and then we started working together. And that was like a year ago. And this is not my group work. This is my private work, which at this stage of life is lovely because I'm not traveling and we can do it over Skype. But the point is, she said to this group of people, and I heard this morning about her partner, that he had changed her life. And then he said, no, it's more than that. I don't even know the right words. Being with him has changed my soul.
Mm.
And, think about that. Every man and woman out there, if you're, as a man, particularly with so much of patriarchy and still at play, and male entitlement still at play in men, it's changing, of course, and it's changing fast, and that's good.
Yeah.
But imagine if your wife came to you and said, being with you has not only changed my life, but it's healed my soul. Could your woman have ever said anything to you more beautiful?
Mm. I've got personal experience in this.
I'll bet you have.
I've had my share of loss,
Mm-hmm.
and finally finding my life partner, my twin flame. And it's one thing to have this, what I talked about before, which is my version of unconditional, or Carl Rogers' version of unconditional love, but on above that even is this tiny little section of the population where each party is not pushing the other person for their life mission, but helping them pursue their life mission, their life purpose. And so you got both of these synergized together, helping each other. Well, you already understand each other, accept each other, and now you're both helping each other move toward their individual life purpose.
Yeah. Well, when two people reach that point where you're no longer in it for what's good for you, and you're not trying to be loved so you feel good about yourself or feel safe, but you're loving love with someone else, that's, you've come a great long distance. And in my rhetorical question, what's a curriculum for love, or for that matter, forgiveness or trust?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is, this podcast that you're doing is part of that curriculum. When we do good work in our churches about getting past defining ourselves as separate because of our faith, but our faith actually allows us to love even those of other faiths and other differences, and we add psychological sophistication to our faith, and we add deep neuroscience understanding to that, and we take all of these things together. Of course, the very mission of human beings on this planet is to love. And I think the creation story is of God emptying himself. The creation story it's told in our Bible. God empties himself, and in that emptiness, all of creation forms. And then I think that act of love that creates creation, how could God create something that would know what love is? And to me, the Adam and Eve story is, he creates the first man, kind of the primal consciousness that we call human consciousness. But how could one person or one consciousness learn to love without another consciousness? And so from soil, literally from the earth, and from a rib, Eve is formed. And now Adam has someone with which to learn love. And Eve is someone with which to learn love. But how can they do that if they can't know the difference between yes and no, right and wrong, good and bad, up and down? And so comes the so-called evil serpent in many other societies. This is a symbol of the awakening transformational energy. It's in the caduceus, of the symbol that accompanies medicine, and that we inherit from from the ancient Greeks, the twin serpents coming up the staff. And so that deep primal life force that allows us to begin to say, yes, no, right, wrong, good, bad, that's what allows us to consciously learn to love. And then you could say everything about human existence. If you really, really go deep, you begin to realize that we are that aspect of nature falling in love with itself. We are that, and therefore falling in love with the very essential, fundamental act of love which created the universe in the first place. God's implicit, unconditional, beginningless, endless love. And you know, if we can see that, then everything else follows. But the left brain rules politics. The fact that we can talk about fake news, the fact that we can just doubt facts themselves, that we can so destabilize our society, but by not no longer really believing that we know in our hearts and in our bodies what's truly right, and that a belief system that punishes other human beings and makes us feel superior in some way to others, that polarizes us, can't be true. It doesn't exist in nature. Nothing in nature doesn't work except in relationship, essentially, to everything else.
Wow. That's huge.
It's how it is. It's
Yeah.
just how it is. And if you're a scientist, you get to know that. But the left brain can start from a complete falsehood and then create a hierarchy of rationality until you reach a point of total absurdity. But as far as the left brain is concerned, it's true.
There was a book I remember seeing, why right-minded people or right-brained people will rule the world. I don't remember much on it, but before we get to the very end here, I've got some other questions I'd like to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
One is are you on the path, or is Mandala of Being one of the suggested ways of getting to a place where I've deemed kind of like that consistent, enduring inner peace, where you're not getting triggered, but it's not repression, is just a long period of time working through, say, the Mandala of Being, to where you can recognize that you're getting triggered, so that you can come back to now and maybe work on it, resolve that if you need to. Is that a beneficial way? It sounded like before you were hinting towards, you're still getting a little triggered here and there, but it's better than it was before.
I think as long as you have a body, there'll be some distance between what we're capable of living and truly unconditional love. But I would say what the Mandala of Being is about, and what the power of awareness that the book is teaching about, is about digesting that which is limiting you at the level of thought, at the level of self-identification, through awareness. So do you digest it because you see it? Do you understand that almost any dynamic, no matter how destructive it seems now, maybe as an adult, was probably not destructive when we learned it as a child. It was probably had real meaning to us. And so the point is, we're here to love with each other. I think our quest for knowledge through science is our desire to understand the way this universe works is an expression of our love. But science can be used, or technology can be used in service to anything. And so the inner work that we all have to do, and which the Mandala of Being explains as clearly as I knew how to be able to explain it at the time I wrote it, and based on working with thousands of people and of course working with myself, it's an infinite game. You don't kick a goal and win. You know what I mean? It's an infinite play. If you think you know what the boundaries are, well, that's your thinking. Um, if you think you've reached an end point, well, there is no end point. If you think you're enlightened, oh, you're probably in trouble, because you may be more enlightened than you were, but it's an infinite play. So, Chris, my feeling is it's really important for people to understand that finite play, finite games, games with rules, games with borders, they're fun to watch. It's fun to see your team win another. But all those players agree to play until one person loses.
Hmm.
One group loses. And when it comes to love and forgiveness and trust and true self-knowledge and humility, it's infinite. There is no end to it. And that's why I want people to hear that I still have places where there is reaction, that I am wise enough to know that I'm responsible for that, therefore I won't act it out, um, that I never blame anyone else. And if I do, it's an opportunity for me to find out just what kind of belief system I'm using to justify any form of blame, because I'm not blaming myself either. I'm just waking up. I'm healing. And we don't heal very quickly just by ourselves. We heal through a relationship, and whether that relationship is with God in the abstract or God in the personified, as with Jesus or the prophet, or whether it's with Buddha nature, where there is no theism in the sense of a God as an object, a God as a thing, it doesn't matter. And when it's between two people, and again, I don't care about the gender, when two people decide to love with each other, that is the best game in town. That is the only final, really game in town. And I haven't. I mean, I'm just so grateful that I can take this journey. I'm grateful I can share it with you. I'm grateful I can share it with all the people I share it with. And and it would just to say that I've arrived, I don't think anyone's arrived. I don't think Buddha arrived. I don't think Jesus, if he could come back here, would say, I arrived. I think he said, greater things than I have done, you shall do. I mean, I think he was saying whatever level of awareness I've achieved, and deep, abiding, resting into a relationship with Father Consciousness,
Okay,
Father,
so
Father
how
Spirit,
about,
that we can go further, onward.
well, not further. I wanted to kind of rephrase and see if this is a little bit more accurate based on your view, based on what you just said. Is not measuring how much trigger you're getting or how often you're being triggered, but your lack of resistance to those resulting feelings, emotions, thoughts, instead of resisting them. Because you mentioned it, you didn't use the word resistance, but I think you used the word contractions, which to me is kind of tension.
Well, it's the
So,
body signaling some form of resistance
right,
of the mind.
right. So is
And
that kind of synonymous with maybe what we're talking about as trigger is really just more of a resistance to life happening right now, or more resistance to a certain thought or a regurgitation to a past event.
I think there's layers and layers and layers of it. And so let's start with the contraction that's created by your thinking, your judgments of others or yourself, the way you justify that through the selectively looking at the past, selectively choosing certain memories, the ones that justify that reaction, the ways it causes us to project into the future. Um, we as human beings don't really have a future at the level of the me consciousness, the ego consciousness. All we have is the hope for a better past or the fear of a worse past. But a person who lands in the now of themselves through their own work and through grace sometimes, but it's always effort and grace. There's always the work. The mandala work is as clear a piece of work as I know of anywhere for how to do this kind of work.
Right.
And and then there's grace. You make an effort, and then suddenly you land back in a spacious, non-contracted openness. Um, And for me, when let's say my skeptical voice comes in or my cynical voice comes in, as it does, for example, because every morning I have a quote practice, and the first part of my practice is extemporaneous singing and chanting and just letting the words come. And this little voice will go, "Oh, you just want to make yourself feel good," or it'll go, "You think this is going to save you," or something like that. And I go, "Oh, hi, skeptic, come on in, have a seat. When in the right context, you have been really useful to me. Come on, cynic, I know you're a defense, I know, but sometimes that cynicism has caused me to poison myself enough that I really did good work afterwards. But basically I say, come on in. And if it's my controller, I come on in, have a seat. Go sit right down here next to me, but I'm not giving you the microphone. You're not taking the stage. You're welcome, but I'm doing my practice, and I do it for love, and it's up to love what love wants to do with it. It's not up to Richard. It's up to love."
Absolutely beautiful. Right. One last question for you. What do you think is the one or two things that are the biggest blocks to inner peace across the board for most people, most humans? Probably
Well,
just everything we talked about.
at the risk of sounding morbid, if ever there's going to be a tombstone for our species, here's what I think it's going to say. They believed in their thoughts. They identified with their thoughts. And they were afraid of their feelings. So what's a feeling you're afraid of? Fear. Until you learn how to journey with fear, in all of its disguises, there's only one fear, but there's 1,000 names. Fear of heights, fear of failure, fear of abandonment, on and on and on. But the sensation, you have an awareness inside of you, which is the spark of God in every human being. And that awareness allows you to have a relationship with fear, not succumb to fear, not just try to fix yourself, not try to save yourself through technology or through behavior. So if we continue to be afraid of our feelings and unable to have a relationship with fear in all its various disguises, then we will keep compensating in ways that ultimately destroy us. And if the left brain wins, and we identify with our thinking, instead of using our thinking as just an instrument of consciousness in service to our hearts, in service to love of love, then that identification with thought is going to destroy us. And that's why if you want to be a Republican, at least don't borrow your identity from it. If you want to be of any faith, use that faith as a path to God, but not as a source of identity. When communities of people come together, that's a blessed thing. We evolved in part as a community animal, but let's not use our community as a surrogate identity. Every person is responsible for their closing down, and just because all of you decide to close down together against someone else doesn't make it right. Mm-hmm. So the two things are identification with our thinking and an inability to journey generatively and creatively and productively with our feelings. It's the fear of the feelings themselves, the fear of loneliness, abandonment, pain, failure, judgment, betrayal, on and on and on.
I love that. Are you including like physical body pain in that pain, or is that just emotional pain?
Up to a certain point, physical body pain can be journeyed with in a very generative way. And it can open your heart. It can just lead you to compassion. It just can break you open in sensitivity to the suffering of others. But it's also exhausting and very, very difficult. And I know this. I had a hip replacement, and I had back surgery. And before that, before I actually had the surgeries, I did so much to try to heal myself, and I was not able to. And at the end of a day of being in continuous physical pain, of course, it reached the point where I was in wheelchairs, to go to the airports, make my travels around the world. They'd pick me up at the door to my bedroom and drive me to the cafeteria, or drive me to the place where the retreat was taking place. And then, the blessing of being able to have a hip replacement and have no more pain. And then finally to have a stenosis, a narrowing of the spinal cord in my lumbar spine, repaired by surgery. I mean, I loved those doctors. I loved that aspect of medicine. We didn't say that I started my professional career as a doctor, and then eventually left it. But those aspects of medicine I love. But it's a whole other conversation to talk about in other ways. But physical pain is very, 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 very difficult. And I know at the end of those days, I wanted to have a drink. And I did. I'd have one, a beer. I'd have a good-sized glass of wine. I'd have 2 ounces of whiskey, maybe. And it eased that pain. And I thought to myself, this is why people become alcoholic, either physical pain or emotional pain. And, when you can be helped, oh, blessed, blessed, blessed. And if you can't, I think there's always help.
Yeah.
Loving someone and being loved by someone cuts your pain tremendously.
And that's there's the physiology for that called endorphins.
Mm-hmm.
Love produces a little bit of that, and some other neurotransmitters that feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a lot of our inability to handle pain and even anxiety, for some reason in today's day and age, has a lot to do with this opiate epidemic. But there is also another topic.
Yeah.
But exactly. Richard, it's been just one big pleasure having you here. And boy, if I can coax you back, I would do it in a heartbeat and have a whole different discussion.
I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to.
Thank you. I'm already looking forward.
This is part of the global curriculum for love.
Okay, good. Yeah. All right. Well, until next time, I want everyone to maybe even rewind and go check out Richard's books. And we didn't even get to talk about some of the others, but what's the latest one? Inside Out Healing?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Inside Out Healing.
Yeah, I can't wait to get my hands on that one. The Mandala of Being, I have several in my practice, and they are always being loaned out. I rarely have them in my library because someone's always reading them.
It's very gratifying to hear.
And I had my very first copy that was just, I've never had this situation before, but it was just basically the whole text was underlined. And just keep underlining. And then I finally said, you know what? Everything is important. Let's just not keep drawing. But it was already 3/4 of the way done. So I had to get a couple more copies, ones without all the drawing in it. But it changed my life, Richard. And thanks for your work. Thanks for your mind and sharing your true heart and trying to coax humanity back into a state of love and gratitude. I think we can do it one mind at a time, one heart at a time, one
relationship at a time,
one relationship at a time, one experience at a time.
Exactly.
All right, Richard.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so
and,
much.
Look forward to having you back.
Definitely.
Welcome to InnerZension Radio.